My name is Margaret Collins, and I am 72 years old as I begin telling this story, though some days I feel far older, as if the weight of my memories has aged me beyond the limits of my years. I live alone now in a quiet house on Maple Street in a small town in Ohio, a house that once echoed with laughter, footsteps, and the warmth of a family I believed would never abandon me. But time has a cruel way of reshaping everything we hold dear, and love, no matter how deep, can sometimes turn into something unrecognizable. I was not always alone. Once, I had a husband who adored me and a son who was the very center of my world. Once, I believed that giving everything to those you love would guarantee that love would return to you in the end. I was wrong, and it took me a lifetime to understand just how wrong I was. I met my husband, Robert Collins, when I was just 21 years old, working as a waitress in a small diner off Route 9. He was kind, soft-spoken, and had a smile that made me feel safe in a way I had never experienced before. We didn't have much when we married, just a small rented apartment with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper. But we had dreams, and we had each other. Robert worked long hours at a manufacturing plant, and I took on odd jobs to help make ends meet. We were not wealthy, but we were happy, and in those early years, happiness felt like it would last forever. When I became pregnant with our son, Daniel, everything in my life shifted. From the moment I first held him in my arms, I knew that my purpose had changed. He was no longer just a part of my life. He was my life. I devoted myself entirely to raising him, often putting my own needs and desires aside without a second thought. Robert used to tell me that I gave too much, that I needed to take care of myself too, but I never listened. To me, a mother's love meant sacrifice, and I wore my sacrifices like a badge of honor. Daniel grew up to be a bright, curious child with a gentle nature that reminded me so much of his father. He loved books, especially stories about heroes and adventure, and he would often sit beside me on the couch, asking me to read to him until he fell asleep. Those were some of the happiest moments of my life, moments I would later replay in my mind like a treasured film, searching for signs of when things began to change. As the years passed, Robert worked tirelessly to provide for us, but the strain of long hours and physical labor began to take its toll on his health. I noticed it long before he admitted it. The way he would come home exhausted, the cough that lingered longer than it should have, the quiet grimace of pain he tried to hide. We didn't have the luxury of expensive health care, and Robert was too proud to complain, so we carried on as if everything was fine. But deep down, I knew we were living on borrowed time. When Daniel was 16, our world shattered. Robert collapsed at work one afternoon, and by the time I reached the hospital, it was already too late. The doctors said it was his heart, something that might have been treated if it had been caught earlier. Those words haunted me for years, might have been treated, because they carried with them a weight of guilt I could never fully escape. I kept wondering if I had pushed him too hard, if I had relied on him too much, if I could have done something differently to save him. After Robert's death, everything fell on my shoulders. I was suddenly a widow with a teenage son, limited savings, and no clear plan for the future. But I didn't allow myself to fall apart. I couldn't. Daniel needed me, and I was determined to give him the life his father had worked so hard to build. I took on multiple jobs, cleaning houses during the day, working at a grocery store in the evenings, and sewing clothes for neighbors late into the night. There were days when I barely slept, days when my body ached so much that I thought I might collapse, but I kept going. I kept going because I believed it would all be worth it. Daniel watched me struggle, and for a long time it seemed to bring us closer. He would help around the house, cook simple meals, and sometimes even take on small jobs to contribute. He would hug me and say, "Don't worry, Mom. One day I'll take care of you." Those words meant everything to me. They gave me strength on the days when I felt like I had nothing left to give. I poured every penny I earned into his education. I wanted him to have opportunities that Robert and I never had. When he was accepted into a good college, I cried, not out of sadness, but out of pride. It felt like all my sacrifices had finally paid off. I remember standing in his empty room after he left for school, holding one of his old books and whispering to myself, "You did it, Margaret. You gave him a future." The years he spent in college were some of the loneliest of my life, but I endured them with quiet hope. He called less frequently as time went on, but I told myself that it was normal. He was busy, building his life, becoming the man I had always dreamed he would be. I didn't want to burden him with my loneliness, so I kept my conversations cheerful, always asking about his studies, his friends, his plans. When he graduated, I attended the ceremony alone, sitting among families who cheered and celebrated together. When Daniel walked across the stage, I felt a surge of pride so powerful that it brought tears to my eyes. In that moment, I believed that everything I had endured, the long nights, the exhaustion, the sacrifices, had been worth it. I believed that our future would be brighter now, that the years of hardship were behind us. After graduation, Daniel found a job in the city and moved into a small apartment. I visited him once, bringing homemade food and cleaning supplies, just as I had always done. His life there felt so different from the one we had shared, modern, fast-paced, filled with people and opportunities I couldn't fully understand. I tried not to feel out of place, reminding myself that this was what I had worked so hard for. It was during one of those visits that I first heard about her. Her name was Emily Carter, and Daniel spoke of her with a light in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. He told me she was smart, ambitious, and came from a well-established family. I smiled and listened, genuinely happy that he had found someone who made him feel that way. At the time, I had no reason to worry. I had no reason to believe that this woman would one day become the source of my deepest pain. When I finally met Emily, she was everything Daniel had described, beautiful, confident, and impeccably dressed. She greeted me politely, but there was something in her eyes, something I couldn't quite place, that made me feel uneasy. I dismissed it as nerves, telling myself that I was simply being overly sensitive. After all, she was important to my son, and that was enough for me. As the months passed, their relationship grew more serious. Daniel spoke of her constantly, and I could see that he was deeply in love. When he told me he was planning to propose, I hugged him and congratulated him, even as a small, inexplicable knot formed in my chest. I ignored that feeling, convincing myself that it was just the natural fear of change. Their wedding was beautiful, held in a grand venue that far exceeded anything I could have ever imagined. Emily's family spared no expense, and everything was perfectly arranged, from the flowers to the music to the elegant reception that followed. I felt out of place among the guests, many of whom were wealthy and sophisticated, but I smiled and did my best to blend in. This was my son's special day, and I wanted nothing more than for him to be happy. As I watched Daniel and Emily exchange their vows, I felt a mixture of emotions, joy, pride, and a strange, lingering sadness that I couldn't quite explain. It was as if I was witnessing the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one in which I no longer played a central role. I told myself that this was how it was supposed to be, that children grow up and create their own families. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away. After the wedding, Daniel moved into a house that Emily's family had helped them purchase. It was large, modern, and filled with everything they could possibly need. I visited them there a few times, always bringing small gifts and homemade meals, trying to maintain the connection we had always shared. But things felt different. Daniel seemed more distant, and Emily, well, Emily was polite, but there was a coldness to her that I couldn't ignore. Still, I kept trying. I told myself that relationships take time, that we simply needed to get to know each other better. I wanted to believe that we could become a family, that we could find a way to coexist peacefully. I had no idea then just how wrong I was, or how much my life was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. After the wedding, I returned to my quiet house on Maple Street, carrying with me a strange emptiness that I could not quite put into words. The rooms that had once been filled with Daniel's laughter now felt larger, colder, as though the walls themselves had begun to forget what it meant to hold a family together. I tried to keep myself busy, just as I had done in the years after Robert's passing, but this loneliness was different. It was not the kind that came from loss alone. It was the kind that came from being slowly replaced. In the beginning, Daniel still called me, though not as often as before. His voice sounded distracted, as if his mind was always somewhere else. He would tell me about work, about his new responsibilities, about how busy life had become. And then, almost always, he would mention Emily, what she had cooked, where they had gone, what plans they were making. I listened patiently, smiling into the phone even though he could not see me, reminding myself that this was what I had wanted for him. A full life, a happy marriage, a future that did not carry the burdens I had known. But as the weeks turned into months, those calls became shorter and less frequent. Sometimes days would pass without a word, and I would find myself staring at the phone, wondering if I should call him first. Often, I did. And every time I told myself it was just a mother checking on her son, not a lonely woman reaching out for connection. The first time I visited them after their wedding, I made sure everything was perfect. I baked Daniel's favorite apple pie, the same recipe I had used since he was a boy, and packed a basket with homemade meals so they wouldn't have to worry about cooking for a few days. I even bought a new dress, nothing fancy, but nicer than what I usually wore, because I wanted to make a good impression on Emily. When I arrived at their house, I hesitated at the door for a moment, taking in its size and elegance. It was so different from the modest home Daniel had grown up in, and I felt a familiar sense of being out of place. But I pushed that feeling aside and rang the bell. Emily opened the door. She greeted me with a polite smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Margaret, you're here," she said, as though my visit had been something she had nearly forgotten. I handed her the basket, explaining what I had brought, but she only glanced at it briefly before setting it aside. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, her tone suggesting that perhaps I shouldn't have. Daniel came down the stairs a moment later, and his face lit up when he saw me. For a brief moment, everything felt like it used to. He hugged me tightly, and I held on to that embrace longer than I probably should have, trying to capture the warmth of it before it slipped away again. We sat together in the living room, and I tried to make conversation, asking about their lives, their plans, their future. Daniel answered kindly, but Emily often spoke for him, steering the conversation in directions that seemed to exclude me. She talked about their social circle, their events, their ambitions, things that felt distant from the life I knew. At one point, I offered to help in the kitchen, but Emily quickly declined. "I've got everything under control," she said, her voice firm but still polite. I nodded and sat back down, feeling strangely useless, as though the role I had once held so naturally had no place here. That visit left me unsettled, though I tried not to dwell on it. I told myself that it was just an adjustment period, that Emily was simply protective of her space, her home, her new life. I wanted to believe that, because the alternative was too painful to consider. Over time, however, small things began to accumulate, little moments that chipped away at my sense of belonging. Invitations that never came, calls that were not returned, conversations that felt increasingly strained, and always there was Emily, standing between Daniel and me like an invisible barrier. One evening, I gathered the courage to call Daniel and ask if they would like to come over for dinner. I had spent the entire day preparing, cooking dishes I knew he loved, setting the table with care, even placing a small bouquet of flowers in the center. When he answered, there was a pause before he spoke. "Mom, we're actually pretty busy these days," he said. "Maybe some other time." I tried to hide my disappointment, telling him I understood, that I knew how hectic life could be. But when I hung up the phone, I sat at the table alone, staring at the empty chairs, feeling a deep ache settle in my chest. It was around that time that I began to notice a change in Daniel's tone whenever we spoke. There was a subtle impatience in his voice, a distance that had not been there before. He no longer asked how I was, no longer lingered on the phone. Our conversations became brief, almost transactional, as though he were fulfilling an obligation rather than speaking to his mother. I started to wonder if I had done something wrong. I replayed our interactions in my mind, searching for moments where I might have offended Emily or overstepped my boundaries. But no matter how hard I looked, I could not find a reason for the growing distance between us. One afternoon, I decided to visit them without calling ahead. It was something I had done many times when Daniel was younger, and a part of me hoped that perhaps the familiarity of it would bring us closer again. I baked cookies that morning, the smell filling my kitchen with a warmth that felt almost like hope, and drove to their house with a nervous excitement I hadn't felt in a long time. When I arrived, I rang the bell and waited. It took a while for the door to open, and when it did, Emily stood there, her expression clearly surprised, and not in a pleasant way. "Margaret," she said, her voice tight, "you should have called first." I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I just thought I was in the area and I wanted to see you both." She hesitated before stepping aside to let me in, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Daniel was not home, she explained, and she seemed in no hurry to make me comfortable. I offered her the cookies, but she barely acknowledged them. We sat in the living room, the silence stretching uncomfortably between us. I tried to make conversation, asking about her day, her work, anything to fill the void, but her responses were short and distant. After a few minutes, she stood up. "I actually have a lot to do," she said. "Maybe you should come back another time after calling." The message was clear. I wasn't welcome. I left shortly after, my heart heavy with a mix of humiliation and sadness. As I drove home, I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. I had never felt so out of place in my own son's life. That night, I sat alone in my living room, the untouched cookies still sitting in the container beside me. I thought about all the years I had spent raising Daniel, all the sacrifices I had made, all the love I had given without hesitation. And for the first time, a painful question began to form in my mind. Had I given too much? But even then, I wasn't ready to face the truth. I wasn't ready to accept that the son I had devoted my life to might be slipping away from me, not because of time or distance, but because someone else had taken my place. I told myself to be patient, to be understanding, to give them space. I told myself that things would get better, that this was just a phase, a temporary shift in our relationship. I clung to those thoughts like a lifeline because the alternative, the idea that I was no longer needed, no longer valued, was too painful to bear. What I didn't realize then was that this was only the beginning. The small cracks that had begun to form in our relationship would soon widen into something far more devastating, something that would shatter everything I thought I knew about love, family, and sacrifice. And at the center of it, all would be a moment so shocking, so humiliating, that it would change the course of my life forever. From that day, I stopped visiting without calling first. I had learned my place, even if it hurt more than I was willing to admit. I told myself that respect was important, that boundaries were necessary, that perhaps I had simply failed to understand the way things worked in their new life. But deep inside, something had shifted. A quiet fear had begun to grow, a fear that I was slowly being pushed out of my own son's world. A few days after that uncomfortable visit, I gathered the courage to call Daniel again. My fingers trembled slightly as I dialed his number, and when he answered, I tried to sound cheerful, as though nothing had happened. "Hi, sweetheart," I said softly. "I was thinking maybe I could come by this weekend. I'll call first this time." I even let out a small laugh, hoping he would hear the effort I was making. There was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than I expected. "Mom," he said finally, his voice careful, almost rehearsed, "this weekend might not be a good time. Emily has plans and we're going to be busy." I swallowed the disappointment rising in my throat. "Oh, that's all right," I replied quickly. "Another time, then." But another time never seemed to come. Weeks turned into months, and my visits became rare. When I did see them, it was usually for short, formal occasions, holidays, birthdays, where everything felt staged, like we were all playing roles rather than living as a family. I would bring gifts, cook food, try to create moments of warmth, but nothing seemed to break through the invisible wall that had formed between us. Emily's attitude toward me remained distant, sometimes polite, sometimes cold, but always controlled. She never raised her voice, never said anything outright cruel, but there was a sharpness in her words, a subtle way of making me feel unwelcome without ever saying so directly. It was as if she had mastered the art of exclusion, and I was the only one who seemed to notice. Daniel, on the other hand, had begun to change in ways that were harder to ignore. He no longer defended me when Emily made dismissive remarks. He no longer tried to include me in their plans. Sometimes, when I spoke, he would glance at her before responding, as though seeking approval. It was a small gesture, but it cut deeper than anything else. I remember one particular evening that still lingers in my mind like a shadow I cannot escape. It was Daniel's birthday, and I had spent days preparing for it. I baked a cake from scratch, decorated it the way I used to when he was a child, and wrapped a gift I had carefully chosen, a watch I had saved up for, something I thought he would treasure. When I arrived at their house, I noticed immediately that something was different. The living room was already decorated, the table set with elegant dishes, and a group of well-dressed guests filled the space with laughter and conversation. Emily greeted me at the door with a tight smile. "Oh, Margaret," she said, "I didn't realize you were coming this early." I thought this was the right time," I stammered, suddenly unsure of myself. "Well, we're actually hosting a small gathering," she replied, "but you can come in." I stepped inside, clutching the cake and the gift, feeling more like an outsider than ever before. Daniel came over to greet me, but his attention was divided, constantly pulled back to his guests. I handed him the gift, and he thanked me quickly before setting it aside, unopened. As the evening went on, I found myself sitting alone in a corner, watching as Emily effortlessly commanded the room. She laughed with her friends, moved gracefully among the guests, and spoke about plans and ambitions that felt far removed from my simple life. Daniel stood beside her, smiling, engaged, completely absorbed in her world. At one point, I overheard a conversation that made my heart sink. One of Emily's friends asked about me, and Emily replied with a light, almost dismissive tone. "Oh, that's Daniel's mom. She's very traditional." The way she said it, the slight pause before the words, carried a meaning that was hard to ignore. I wanted to leave then. I wanted to quietly slip out the door and disappear before anyone noticed. But I stayed, telling myself that I had every right to be there, that I was his mother. Still, the feeling of not belonging clung to me like a weight I could not shake. When the cake was finally brought out, I hesitated. I had brought one too, but there was no place for it on the table. Emily had already arranged for a beautifully decorated cake from a bakery, one that looked far more impressive than mine. I quietly set my cake aside, telling myself it didn't matter. As everyone gathered around to sing, I stood at the back, my hands clasped tightly together. Daniel blew out the candles, smiling, surrounded by people who seemed to fit perfectly into his new life. For a moment, I searched his face for something, some sign that he still needed me, that I still mattered in the same way I once had. But I found nothing. Later that night, as I prepared to leave, I approached him one last time. "Did you like the gift?" I asked softly. He nodded. "Yeah, Mom, thanks. I'll open it later." Later. That word echoed in my mind as I drove home, the darkness of the road mirroring the heaviness in my heart. It was after that night that I began to notice something else, something that filled me with a quiet, growing unease. Daniel had started asking questions about my house. At first, they seemed harmless. He would ask if I was managing the maintenance, if everything was in good condition, if I had considered making any renovations. I answered honestly, thinking he was simply concerned for me. But over time, those questions became more frequent, more specific. He asked about the value of the property, about the size of the land, about whether I had ever thought of selling it. Each time, I brushed it off, telling him that I was comfortable where I was, that this house held too many memories for me to leave. One evening, during a phone call, he brought it up again. "Mom," he said casually, "have you ever thought about downsizing? I mean, that house is pretty big for just one person." I felt a small knot form in my stomach. "I like my home, Daniel," I replied gently. "It's where your father and I built our life. It's where I raised you." There was a brief silence before he spoke again. "Yeah, I get that, but maybe it's time to think about the future." The future. I didn't know then how much that word would come to haunt me. I tried to push those thoughts aside, convincing myself that he was simply looking out for me, that he wanted me to be safe, comfortable. But something about the way he spoke, the way he kept returning to the subject, made it hard to ignore the growing sense of unease. Looking back now, I realized that those conversations were not as innocent as I believed. They were the beginning of something much darker, something that would soon reveal itself in ways I could never have anticipated. At the time, however, I was still holding on to hope. Hope that things would change, that the distance between us would close, that the bond we once shared would somehow find its way back to us. I had no idea that the very house I clung to for comfort, the place that held all my memories, was about to become the center of a storm that would tear my world apart in the most unimaginable way. The more Daniel spoke about my house, the more restless I became, though I tried my best not to show it. At first, I convinced myself that it was just concern, the natural worry of a son thinking about his aging mother. But something in his tone had changed, something that no longer felt like care but calculation, and that realization sat heavily on my heart. I began to notice that every conversation we had eventually circled back to the same topic, no matter how it started. I would tell him about my day, about the garden I had been tending, about the quiet routine I had built for myself, and somehow, without fail, he would bring up the house again, asking about repairs, about paperwork, about its value in a way that felt too deliberate to be accidental. One afternoon, he called me unexpectedly, his voice unusually warm, almost overly affectionate. "Mom, I've been thinking about you," he said, and for a moment my heart lifted in a way I hadn't felt in months. I clung to that tone, to the familiar softness that reminded me of the boy he used to be. "I think I should come visit you this weekend," he added. My eyes filled with tears at the thought of seeing him, of having him in my home again, walking through the same halls where he had grown up. I agreed immediately, my voice trembling with a mixture of joy and nervous anticipation. I spent the entire week preparing for his visit, cleaning every corner of the house, polishing the furniture, and cooking all his favorite meals. I wanted everything to be perfect, just like it used to be when he was younger. I even went into his old room, dusting the shelves and straightening the bed, though I knew he probably wouldn't sleep there. It was more for me than for him, a way of holding on to something that felt like it was slipping away. When Saturday finally arrived, I woke up early, my heart pounding with excitement. I stood by the window, watching for his car, rehearsing in my mind all the things I wanted to say, all the questions I wanted to ask. When he finally pulled into the driveway, I felt a rush of emotion so strong that I had to steady myself before opening the door. Daniel stepped out of the car, and for a moment, everything else faded away. He looked older, more polished, dressed in clothes that reflected a life far removed from the one we had shared, but he was still my son. I walked toward him, and when he hugged me, I closed my eyes, holding on to that moment as tightly as I could. Come in," I said, my voice bright with forced cheerfulness. "I made all your favorites." He smiled, but there was something distracted in his expression, something that made my heart sink just a little. Still, I pushed those thoughts aside and led him inside, eager to make the most of the time we had together. We sat down at the dining table, and I watched as he ate, hopping to see the same joy he used to show when he tasted my cooking. He complimented the food, but it felt automatic, as though he were saying it out of habit rather than genuine appreciation. I tried to ignore the feeling and focused instead on keeping the conversation alive. For a while, we talked about simple things, his work, his routine, the weather. But it didn't take long for the conversation to shift, just as it always did. He leaned back in his chair, glancing around the house with a thoughtful expression. "You've kept the place in good shape," he said. I smiled. "I try my best, it means a lot to me." He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the walls, the furniture, the photographs that captured moments of a life that now felt so distant. "It's a big house, Mom," he said after a moment. "Too big for just one person." There it was again, that same familiar turn in the conversation, the same subtle shift that made my chest tighten. "I manage just fine," I replied gently. "I've lived here for so long, it doesn't feel big to me." He hesitated, as though choosing his words carefully. "Have you ever thought about moving somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to maintain?" I set my fork down, suddenly unable to continue eating. "Why do you keep asking me that?" I asked quietly. He looked at me, surprised by the question, or perhaps by the tone in my voice. "I'm just thinking about what's best for you," he said. "You shouldn't have to handle everything on your own." "I've been handling things on my own for a long time," I replied, my voice steady but firm. Since your father passed away. The mention of Robert seemed to create a brief silence between us. For a moment, I thought the conversation might end there, that he might understand what this house meant to me, what it represented. But instead, he leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting into something more serious. "Emily and I have been talking," he said, and those words alone were enough to send a chill through me. "We think it might be a good idea for you to consider selling the house." I felt as though the air had been knocked out of me. "Selling," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," he continued, his tone calm, almost casual. "The market is good right now. You could get a great price for it, and then you wouldn't have to worry about upkeep or anything like that. You could move into a smaller place, something more manageable." I stared at him, searching his face for any sign that this was just a suggestion, something he would drop if I expressed my discomfort. But there was something in his eyes, a determination that made my heart ache. "Daniel," I said slowly, "this is my home. It's not just a house. It's where you grew up. It's where your father lived. I can't just sell it." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I get that, Mom, I really do. But you have to think about the future. It's not practical for you to stay here forever." The word practical echoed in my mind, sounding cold and distant compared to the emotions tied to every corner of that house. "Not everything is about being practical," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. "Some things are about memories, about love." He didn't respond immediately, and for a moment the room felt unbearably quiet. Then he spoke again, his voice softer but no less firm. "You can still have those memories without holding on to the house," he said. "Sometimes letting go is the best thing you can do." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, though I hadn't realized I was crying. "For who?" I asked. "For me or for you?" He looked away, and that was the moment something inside me began to break. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a crack in the foundation of everything I had believed about our relationship. The rest of the visit passed in a blur. We avoided the subject, speaking instead about trivial things that felt hollow and forced. When he finally left, I stood at the door, watching as he drove away, feeling a deep, aching emptiness settle over me. That night, I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs, as though I were trying to reassure myself that everything was still there, that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The house no longer felt like a place of comfort. It felt like something under threat, something I might lose. I sat in the living room, staring at the old picture of Robert and me on our wedding day, and for the first time in years, I felt truly afraid. Not of being alone, I had learned to live with that, but of losing the last piece of my life that still felt whole. I didn't know it then, but that conversation was only the beginning. The suggestion to sell my home was not just a passing thought. It was part of a plan, one that would soon unfold in ways that would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about my own son. And somewhere, deep in my heart, a quiet voice began to whisper a truth I wasn't ready to face, that the love I had given so freely might not have been enough to protect me from what was coming next. After that visit, a strange tension settled into my days, like a storm lingering just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to break. I tried to return to my routine, to find comfort in the small, familiar things that had always helped me endure difficult times, but nothing felt the same anymore. Every room in the house seemed to echo with Daniel's words, repeating them over and over until I could no longer ignore the fear they carried. I began to sleep less, waking up in the middle of the night with a heaviness in my chest, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Why was he so insistent? Why now, after all these years? And why did it feel like this wasn't just a suggestion, but something more, something inevitable? Days passed without a call from him, and though that had become normal, this time it felt different. This time, the silence felt deliberate, as though he was waiting for something, for me to give in, perhaps, or to come to the conclusion he wanted without him having to push further. I refused to call him first, something I had rarely done before. It wasn't pride, not exactly, but a quiet need to hold on to whatever little control I still had left in my life. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the sun set behind the trees, the phone finally rang. My heart skipped a beat when I saw Daniel's name on the screen. For a brief moment, hope flickered inside me, fragile and uncertain. I answered quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hello, Daniel." "Hey, Mom," he replied, his tone neutral, almost businesslike. That small detail alone was enough to make my heart sink, but I listened carefully, waiting for what he had to say. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he continued. I closed my eyes briefly, bracing myself. "About the house?" I asked quietly. There was a short pause before he answered. "Yeah, Emily and I have been looking into some options, and we think we found a really good opportunity." The way he said we made something twist painfully inside me. It was no longer just him. It was both of them, united in something that felt like it was against me. "What kind of opportunity?" I asked, though part of me already knew I wouldn't like the answer. "Well," he began, sounding more confident now, "there's a developer interested in properties in your area. They're offering really good money, Mom, way more than what the house is probably worth. It's a great deal." I felt my grip tighten on the phone. "I'm not interested in selling," I said, my voice firmer than I expected it to be. "Mom, just listen for a second," he insisted, a hint of impatience creeping into his tone. "You could take that money and move somewhere smaller, somewhere easier, maybe even closer to us." Closer to us? The words sounded comforting on the surface, but something about them felt hollow, almost rehearsed. "And what happens to this house?" I asked. "What happens to everything your father and I built?" "It's just a house," he replied, and those 4 words cut deeper than anything he had said before. Just a house. I felt as though the ground beneath me had shifted. "It's not just a house to me," I said, my voice trembling now. "It's my home, it's my life." He let out a quiet sigh, the kind that carries frustration more than understanding. "You're being emotional about this," he said. "You need to think logically." Emotion, logic, as if the two could simply replace each other, as if a lifetime of memories could be reduced to numbers and convenience. "I am thinking," I replied softly, "and my answer is no." There was silence on the other end of the line, heavy and uncomfortable. For a moment, I thought he might argue further, push harder, try to convince me again. But when he spoke, his voice had changed, becoming colder, more distant. "Fine," he said. "Do what you want." And just like that, the call ended. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. The conversation replayed in my mind again and again, each word leaving a deeper mark than the last. It wasn't just what he had said. It was how he had said it, the lack of warmth, the absence of care. It felt as though I was no longer speaking to my son, but to someone else entirely. In the days that followed, I heard nothing from him. No calls, no messages, nothing. The silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing day, until it felt almost suffocating. I tried to distract myself, to keep busy, but my thoughts always drifted back to the same place, the same painful realization that something between us had changed in a way that could not be undone. Then, one afternoon, something happened that made my heart drop in a way I will never forget. I was in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor or perhaps a delivery, but when I looked out the window, I saw Daniel's car. My heart raced as I hurried to the door, a mixture of surprise and hope filling my chest. But when I opened the door, it wasn't just Daniel standing there. Emily was with him. She stepped forward before he could say a word, her expression composed but unmistakably cold. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but firm. Something in her tone made a chill run down my spine. This wasn't a casual visit. This wasn't a son coming to see his mother. This was something else entirely. I stepped aside, letting them in, my hands trembling slightly as I closed the door behind them. The air inside the house suddenly felt heavier, as though it had been filled with something unspoken, something waiting to be revealed. We sat in the living room, the same room where I had once held Daniel as a child, where I had comforted him, laughed with him, built a lifetime of memories. But now it felt unfamiliar, almost che ou je, as though it no longer belonged to me. Emily was the first to speak. "We've been thinking a lot about your situation," she began, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "And we really believe it's time for you to make a practical decision." My heart pounded in my chest as I looked from her to Daniel, searching his face for some sign of hesitation, some indication that he wasn't fully on board with whatever was about to happen. But he avoided my gaze, staring instead at the floor. "I already told Daniel how I feel," I said quietly. "I'm not selling my house." Emily's lips pressed into a thin line, her composure slipping just slightly. "Margaret," she said, her voice tightening, "this isn't just about what you feel. It's about what makes sense." "What makes sense to who?" I asked, my voice shaking now. "To all of us," she replied quickly. "This house is an asset, and it's being wasted. You're living here alone when it could be used for something much more valuable." Used. The word echoed in my mind, sharp and unsettling. "It's my home," I said again, though my voice felt weaker this time. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder? As if I was the one creating the problem. As if I was the one taking something away. I felt something inside me begin to crumble, a slow, painful realization taking hold. This wasn't a conversation. This wasn't a suggestion. This was pressure. And for the first time, I understood that they weren't going to let this go. From that moment, something inside me refused to bend any further, even though my heart felt like it was breaking piece by piece. I looked at both of them sitting there in my living room. My son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of love I possessed, and his wife, whose presence now felt like a shadow stretching across everything I held dear. And I realized that I was no longer part of their world in the way I once had been. I was not a mother to be cared for, not a person to be understood. I had become an obstacle. "I am not selling this house," I said again, more clearly this time, forcing my trembling voice into something steady. My hands were clasped tightly in my lap, my fingers cold despite the warmth of the room. "This is my final decision." Emily let out a quiet breath, one that sounded more like irritation than acceptance. She leaned back slightly, crossing her arms, her posture no longer pretending politeness. "You're being unreasonable," she said, her tone losing the softness it once carried. "You're thinking emotionally instead of practically." I felt a sharp sting in my chest, but I did not look away. "And you're thinking about something that doesn't belong to you," I replied, surprising even myself with the firmness in my words. The room fell silent for a moment, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like something invisible pressing down on your shoulders. Daniel shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but he still didn't look at me. That hurt more than Emily's words ever could. "Mom," he said finally, his voice strained, "why are you making this so difficult? We're trying to help you." Help, that word, once so comforting, now sounded hollow. "If this is help," I said quietly, "then why does it feel like you're trying to take something away from me?" He didn't answer immediately, and that silence spoke louder than anything else. Emily, however, did not hesitate. "Because sometimes people don't know what's best for them," she said sharply, "and someone has to step in and make the right decision." I felt something inside me tighten, a mixture of anger and disbelief that I had never allowed myself to feel before. "And you think that someone is you?" I asked. She met my gaze without hesitation. "Yes." The boldness of her answer left me momentarily speechless. I turned to Daniel, my eyes searching his face, pleading silently for him to say something, to defend me, to remind her that this was my home, my life. But he remained quiet, his expression distant, as though he had already chosen a side. That was the moment I understood something I had been trying to avoid for a long time. This wasn't just Emily's doing. This wasn't just her influence or her ideas. Daniel agreed with her. The realization hit me harder than anything else, more painful than the coldness in her voice, more devastating than the pressure they were putting on me. My own son, the one I had sacrificed everything for, was sitting in front of me, allowing this to happen. "I think you should leave," I said suddenly, my voice barely above a whisper but firm enough to carry through the room. Both of them looked at me, surprised. Emily's eyebrows lifted slightly, as though she hadn't expected resistance. Daniel finally met my eyes, confusion flickering across his face. "What?" he asked. "I said you should leave," I repeated, this time a little stronger. "I don't want to have this conversation anymore." Emily let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You're seriously asking us to leave, after we came all the way here to help you?" "Yes," I said, "because this doesn't feel like help." Daniel stood up slowly, running a hand through his hair, his frustration now visible. "Fine," he said, "if that's how you want it." I watched as they moved toward the door, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. For a brief moment, I thought, hoped, that Daniel might turn back, might say something, might show even the smallest sign that he still cared. But he didn't. Emily reached the door first, her hand on the handle. She paused for a second, turning slightly to look at me. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice cold and certain. "And you'll regret it." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat felt too tight, my chest too heavy. They left without another word, the door closing behind them with a finality that echoed through the house. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space they had occupied just moments before, trying to understand how everything had come to this. The silence that followed was overwhelming. It wasn't the quiet I had grown used to over the years. It was deeper, heavier. Filled with something that felt like loss but sharper, more immediate. I walked slowly back into the living room and sat down in the same chair, my hands still trembling. For the first time in my life, I felt truly alone. Not because my husband was gone, not because my son had grown up and moved away, but because the connection I had always believed would remain unbreakable had begun to fracture in a way I could no longer ignore. I replayed the conversation in my mind, every word, every expression, every moment where I had hoped things might turn out differently. But no matter how many times I went over it, the outcome remained the same. They wanted my house, and they weren't going to stop. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the house around me, the creaking of the wood, the ticking of the clock, the distant hum of the wind outside. These were the sounds that had once comforted me, that had made me feel safe. Now, they only reminded me of how fragile everything had become. I began to think about what I would do if they pushed harder, if they came back with more pressure, more demands. The thought of losing this house, of being forced out of the place that held every memory of my life, filled me with a fear I had never known before. But alongside that fear, something else began to take shape. A quiet determination. I had spent my entire life giving to my husband, to my son, to everyone I loved. I had sacrificed without question, believing that love meant putting others first, no matter the cost. But now, for the first time, I realized that if I didn't stand up for myself, there would be nothing left of me to protect. And I wasn't ready to lose everything. Not yet. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness that seemed to settle deep in my chest, a weight that made every movement feel slow and deliberate. I had spent the previous night replaying the events over and over, trying to make sense of them, trying to find some thread of hope that Daniel and Emily might change their minds, but there was none. I went about my morning routine mechanically, washing dishes, tidying up the living room, preparing breakfast, all while my mind spun with scenarios of what they might do next. I thought about reaching out to Daniel, trying to reason with him, to remind him of the bond we once shared, but something inside me held back. The hurt was too deep, the betrayal too raw. I realized that any words I spoke now might not reach him, that he might be too far gone in his new life to see the pain he was causing me. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my hands, and felt an unfamiliar resolve taking root. This house had been mine for decades, a place of memories, of love, of life that I had built with Robert and raised Daniel in. And no matter what they thought, no matter how persuasive Emily tried to be, no matter how distant Daniel had become, I would not let them take it from me. I began to think of ways to protect my home, to safeguard the life I had worked so hard to preserve. I realized that standing my ground would not be easy. There would be arguments, there might be manipulation, and surely there would be days when my heart ached with loneliness and doubt. But I also knew that I had to endure, for this was not just a house. It was my sanctuary, the last bastion of a life that was rapidly slipping away from me. As the morning light filled the room, I felt a quiet determination rising, mingled with fear and sorrow, but stronger than either. I would fight for my home, for my memories, for the last piece of my life that was still truly mine. The following weeks were some of the hardest I had ever faced. Every day, I could feel a subtle tension lingering in the air, a weight pressing down on me as though the walls themselves were aware of the storm building outside. I avoided calling Daniel, afraid of the conversations that always seemed to circle back to the same painful topic. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the fear that he might take action without speaking to me first. I spent hours wandering through the house, touching the furniture, the photographs, the objects that held fragments of my past, reminding myself that they were mine, that no one could take them from me without my consent. I thought about my life with Robert, the love we had shared, the sacrifices we had made together, and how much of that had been preserved in these walls. Those memories had been my anchor for decades, and now they were all I had to remind me of who I was. One evening, I received a call from Daniel. My hands shook as I picked up the phone, unsure of what tone to expect, unsure if this was another attempt to convince me to sell. "Mom," he said, his voice careful, almost rehearsed, "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing." I forced a small, polite smile even though he couldn't see it. "I'm fine, Daniel, thank you for calling." There was a pause, and I could feel the unspoken tension hanging in the line. "We still think it's a good idea for you to consider moving," he continued softly, as though repeating the same words would make them more acceptable. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. "Daniel, I've already told you my decision. I am not selling. This is my home. It always will be." Another pause, longer this time, and I could almost hear him weighing his words, measuring his next step. "I understand," he said finally, though there was a coolness in his tone that hadn't been there before. "But I hope you'll think about it." That was the call. No argument, no pleading, just a subtle reminder that the conversation wasn't over. After hanging up, I felt both relief and anxiety. Relief that he hadn't pressured me further, anxiety that this was far from finished. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the soft light of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls, and I realized that the battle for my home and for my dignity was only beginning. I couldn't predict what Emily and Daniel would do next, but I knew one thing: I would not give in easily. The house was more than wood and bricks. It was the embodiment of a lifetime of love, memory, and sacrifice. Losing it would mean losing the last piece of my identity. I made a silent vow to myself, sitting there in the quiet, to protect it at all costs. Even if it meant standing against my own son, even if it meant enduring pain I had never imagined, I would not let them take what was rightfully mine. The thought was terrifying, yet strangely empowering, and as I looked around the room at the life I had built, I knew that no one could break me, not yet. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house grew heavier with each passing day. Every knock at the door, every ring of the phone made my heart race, fearing that it might be Daniel and Emily coming to pressure me again. I found myself watching the driveway more often than I cared to admit, my mind filled with worst-case scenarios of what might happen next. But I refused to let that fear control me entirely. I reminded myself that this house was mine, that it held decades of my life, and that I had a right to defend it. I began taking extra precautions, keeping important documents and papers in a secure place, checking locks, and making mental notes of anything that could be used against me. It was exhausting, emotionally and physically, but necessary. One afternoon, I decided to visit the local community center, hopping to distract myself from the constant anxiety. Walking among neighbors, hearing their stories, and chatting about ordinary life gave me a temporary sense of relief, a reminder that the world outside my house still existed and still held normalcy. Yet, even in the midst of that distraction, my thoughts returned to Daniel and Emily, to the way they had subtly begun to isolate me from the life I had once shared with my son. When I returned home, the mailbox held a letter addressed to me in Daniel's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it, bracing myself for the contents. Inside was a polite, carefully worded note expressing concern for my well-being and suggesting again that it might be better if I considered other options for living arrangements. The words were wrapped in niceties, but the intent was clear. It was pressure disguised as care, and it cut me more deeply than any anger ever could. I sat down, the letter trembling in my hands, feeling a mixture of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. My son, my own flesh and blood, was actively participating in the attempt to take my home from me, and Emily had orchestrated it all with precision. I realized that the battle I had been bracing for wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about my dignity, my autonomy, and the respect I deserved as a mother. That night, I walked through the house slowly, touching each wall, each piece of furniture, each photograph. Every object seemed to whisper memories of Daniel as a boy, of Robert and me building a life together, of the quiet, everyday moments that had made this house a home. The thought of losing it was unbearable. And yet, in the midst of that fear, a spark of determination ignited. I would not give in. I would not allow them to take what was mine. No matter what it took, I would fight, not just for the walls and the land, but for the life and love embedded in every corner of this home. This was my life, my sanctuary, and they would not break me. Even if it meant standing against my own son, I was prepared to endure anything. The house would remain mine, and I would protect it with every ounce of strength left in me, even if the struggle left scars that would never fully heal. The following days were a mixture of quiet vigilance and restless anxiety. Every morning, I woke early, moving through the house with a careful attentiveness, checking locks, reviewing important papers, and making sure nothing could be used against me. Even the smallest sound outside, a car door closing, footsteps on the driveway, made my heart race, reminding me that Daniel and Emily could appear at any moment. I spent hours in the living room, looking at old photographs, tracing my fingers over the frames, remembering moments of laughter and love, and holding on to the life that had been built within these walls. Yet, despite my vigilance, I could feel the pressure mounting, invisible yet insistent. It was not just the fear of losing my home. It was the creeping realization that my son, the boy I had raised with so much love, was now part of the force trying to take it from me. One afternoon, I heard a knock at the door. My stomach tightened, and my hands shook as I moved toward it. Peeking through the curtain, I saw Emily standing there, a polite smile on her face, but her eyes cold and calculating. "Hello, Margaret," she said smoothly. "I thought I'd drop by to see how you're doing." I forced a small smile, careful to hide my apprehension. "I'm fine, Emily. Please come in." She stepped inside without waiting for further invitation, glancing around the house with a practiced interest. Her eyes lingered on the furniture, the photographs, the layout, and I could sense the subtle judgment in every glance. "You've kept everything in such good shape," she said, almost as a compliment, but I knew it was a veiled comment on the value of the property. "It's impressive." I nodded politely, keeping my voice calm. "I do my best." There was a pause, and then she continued, her tone shifting slightly. "Daniel and I really think you should reconsider selling. It would make things so much easier for you." I felt my chest tighten, my hands clenching in my lap. "I've already told you my decision," I said slowly, my voice firm. "This is my home. I will not sell it." Emily's polite demeanor didn't falter, but I could sense her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Margaret, I know this is difficult for you, but think about the practical side. You're alone in a big house. It requires upkeep, maintenance, expenses." "It is my home," I interrupted gently but firmly. "And I will manage it as I always have. I do not need a lecture about what is practical. My decision is final." For a moment, there was silence. Emily's lips pressed together tightly, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "I see," she said finally. "I hope you'll reconsider." "We only want what's best for you," I nodded, forcing a polite smile that did not reach my eyes. "I appreciate your concern, but I am content here. Please understand that this is not up for discussion." She lingered for a moment longer, perhaps hoping to sway me with her presence, but eventually she straightened, adjusted her coat, and headed toward the door. "Very well," she said, her tone calm but with an unmistakable edge. "I'll be in touch." As the door closed behind her, I felt a shiver run through me, a mixture of relief and dread. She had come, observed, and left, but I knew this would not be the last visit. The quiet of the house returned, heavier than before, and I sat down, hands trembling slightly, staring at the walls that had been my sanctuary. I knew one thing with certainty: this battle was far from over. I had stood my ground, but Emily and Daniel were relentless, and I had to be stronger than I had ever been before. I thought of Robert, of Daniel as a boy, of the memories embedded in every corner of this house, and I made a silent vow to myself. No matter what tactics they used, No matter how often they tried to pressure me, I would not give in. This was my life, my home, and the last piece of my dignity. They might try to take it, but they would not succeed, not while I still had the strength to fight. The following week felt like walking through a minefield. Every sound, every unexpected movement outside made me flinch, reminding me that Daniel and Emily could return at any moment. I spent hours organizing the house, not for them, but for myself. A silent reassurance that everything I had built, everything I had cherished, was still intact. I went through drawers, dusted old furniture, and rearranged photographs, tracing my fingers over memories that had become my lifeline. Even as I worked, the fear gnawed at me, persistent and relentless. I couldn't escape it, but I refused to let it dictate my actions. One morning, as I prepared tea in the kitchen, the doorbell rang. My heart leapt, and my hands trembled as I wiped them on my apron and moved cautiously toward the door. When I opened it, Daniel was standing there, looking calm, collected, but with a seriousness in his eyes that immediately set my nerves on edge. "Mom," he said softly, "we need to talk." I stepped aside to let him in, my chest tight, my mind bracing for what was coming. He walked past me into the living room, his eyes scanning the familiar furniture and photographs, but not stopping to linger. He finally sat down in his usual chair, and I took my place across from him, careful to keep my expression neutral, though my heart raced. "I wanted to understand why you are so set on keeping the house," he began, his voice steady but probing. I swallowed hard, gathering my thoughts. "Because it's my home," I said simply. "It holds my life, my memories, everything your father and I built together. It is not just a house, it is my life." Daniel leaned back, running a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. "I know, Mom," he said slowly, "but Emily and I worry about you. This house is large, expensive to maintain, and you're alone. It's not practical." "Practical," I echoed, my voice calm but firm. "You speak of practicality. But what about love? What about the life that exists within these walls? Can that be measured in practicality? This house is not an investment, Daniel. It's my home, and it always will be." He remained quiet for a moment, his gaze dropping to the floor. Then he looked up, his eyes clouded with a mixture of emotion I couldn't quite place. "Mom, I don't want to fight with you," he said softly. I think about the future, about what could happen if you're here alone." His words should have comforted me, but instead they made the ache in my chest grow sharper. "Daniel," I said gently, "I have lived here alone for years. I am capable, and I have the strength to continue. My decision is not a refusal to hear you. It is a refusal to surrender my life to fear or to someone else's control." He sighed, leaning back, his hands clasped together. "I just want what's best for you," he whispered, and there it was again, the thin veil of concern masking the desire to control, to push me into something I did not want. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, but I held my head high. "Daniel, I understand your concern and I appreciate your intentions, but the choice is mine, and this is my home. If you love me, you will respect that." For a long time, he said nothing. The silence stretched between us, heavy and tense, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between his loyalty to Emily and the son he once was. Finally, he stood, his expression unreadable. "I'll leave you for now," he said quietly, "but think about what I said." He walked toward the door, pausing only briefly to glance back. "We only want what's best for you," he repeated, the words sounding hollow this time. As the door closed behind him, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow wash over me. Relief that the conversation was over for now, sorrow at the realization that my own son was torn between me and his wife, caught in a conflict that was slowly eroding the bond we had once shared. I sat down in my chair, the familiar surroundings of my home both comforting and painful, and I whispered to myself, "I will not give up. This is my life, and no one will take it from me." That night, as I lay in bed listening to the quiet creaks of the house, I felt the weight of loneliness pressing down, but also a quiet strength growing within me. The battle for my home was far from over, but for the first time, I understood that my resolve was stronger than any pressure, stronger than any persuasion, even stronger than the betrayal that came from those I loved most. The weeks that followed were a test of endurance unlike anything I had ever faced. Each morning, I awoke to the quiet of the house, my sanctuary, and each night I went to bed with a lingering tension in my chest, a reminder that the struggle was far from over. I continued my daily routines with deliberate care, tending to the house, keeping everything in order, making sure that nothing could be used against me. The memories embedded in these walls, of Daniel as a child, of Robert's laughter, of birthdays and holidays celebrated in warmth and love, gave me strength that no words or actions could erode. I felt the pressure from Daniel and Emily like a shadow that hovered over my life, subtle yet persistent, but I refused to let it dominate my thoughts. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor, an old friend from the neighborhood, someone who had known me and Robert for decades. She looked around the house with genuine admiration, commenting on how well I had maintained everything and how the spirit of the home seemed untouched despite the passing years. Her presence reminded me that my life, my efforts, and my memories were valuable not just to me, but to those who had shared in pieces of this life with me. It was a reassurance that I was not entirely alone, that my home still held meaning beyond its walls. That evening, as the sun set and the warm light filled the rooms, I sat in my favorite chair, the one where I had read to Daniel as a boy, and reflected on everything that had transpired. I thought about the pain of seeing my son and his wife attempt to pressure me, about the loneliness that had accompanied those moments, and about the resilience I had discovered within myself. The house had become more than a place to live. It had become a testament to my endurance, my strength, and my unwavering sense of self. When Daniel and Emily did come back to visit, their polite facades could not mask the tension, but I was ready. I spoke firmly, calmly, and without hesitation, reinforcing that this house was mine, that my decisions were final, and that their attempts to sway me would not succeed. Their expressions shifted with each visit, from subtle irritation to resigned acknowledgement, but I remained steadfast. Over time, the visits became less frequent, the pressure less intense, as they gradually realized that their efforts would not bend me. In the quiet that followed, I felt a profound sense of victory, not just for keeping my home, but for reclaiming my own voice, my own authority, and my own dignity. I had faced the ultimate test, standing firm against the very people I had loved most and surviving with my integrity intact. Sitting in the living room one evening, the familiar shadows stretching across the walls, I closed my eyes and let out a deep breath. This house, with all its memories, all its love and loss, was still mine. I had given my son everything, endured heartbreak and betrayal, yet I had not lost myself in the process. I realized then that my life, though tested and scarred, was still whole. My home stood as a monument to that resilience, a sanctuary where I could continue to live, to remember, and to find peace. And in that moment, despite all the pain and sorrow, I felt a quiet, unwavering hope, a hope that I would continue to endure, to protect what was mine, and to live out the rest of my days surrounded by the memories, love, and strength that no one could ever take away.